Well, I've been giving talks for a few years now, and when I first started, somebody said to me, whatever you do, don't start with a list. There's my list. I put that down basically, not because I'm going to cover everything. If I did cover everything even briefly, we'd be here till tomorrow at least. So I shall be really dealing more or less with the three of the top four, and then we'll go on to drainage. Ventilation, surveying and ore dressing really are subjects for other talks. And I think you'd rather see some things in mind which I'm sure the majority of you will never have known existed. But they do exist in Swaledale. Before we go any further, can anybody tell me what the purpose of mining is? Bloody hell, it's nice to have such an educated audience, so I'm going to tell you. The purpose of mining, now dog, the purpose of mining is to make money. And I'd like you to bear that in mind right through this talk, because it's behind a lot of the reasons for what went on. Before we go any further, I'd like to show you what a mineral vein looks like underground. This is in Danby Mine in Artengasthdale. I'm including Artengasthdale in the talk because just like Hard Level Gill and Gunnerside Gill, it's a tributary of the Swale. This vein doesn't carry any galena. If it did, it wouldn't be here. It's mainly comprised of varieties, and it runs through a country rock on either side of it of shale, which is between the main limestone and the underset limestone. Another one, in Faggot Hill Mine, is between two cheeks of limestone, and that's the main limestone, and it carries just calcite. Again, not of any interest to the miners at that time. It was quite popular, however, in the 1920s for pebble dashing, but that's another story, and several mines around Greenhow Hill were worked for it. To describe the vein, you would say that it was leaning probably to the left, wouldn't you? Well, the technical term is hading. It hades from the bottom right to the top left, and it dips from the top right to the bottom left. The left-hand cheek, being the lower one, is the footwall. The right-hand cheek, the higher one, is the hanging wall. Mineralisation varies a lot in Swaledale. It does in a lot of these type of veins. And it was found that veins with little or no throw displacement, because there are also faults sometimes. Veins with little or no displacement are more likely to carry payable ore, galena, lead sulfide. Those with more than 40-foot displacement very rarely, if ever, have carried any ore in Swaledale, Artengasthdale. Those in between carry varying amounts of ore in different stratas, the main limestone being by far the best. Shales, not usually, grits sometimes. Veins can vary in thickness from literally the width of this room to as thick as my finger. Some veins are not really veins at all. The local miners here call them strings. And they're literally joints in the limestone which have opened up a bit and become filled with vein-forming minerals. Where did these veins come from? Well, the country rock, hereabouts, is part of the Yoredale series, which forms part of the Lower Carboniferous, about 310 million years ago, but we're not to a month or two, so 310 million years will do for me. On top of that, we've got the Upper Carboniferous, your coal measures, further south, further north in Northumberland, across in Wales. And then when this had happened, at the end of the Carboniferous period, the Earth grew rather restless One of the reasons thought to be for that was that it was cooling, and as the Earth's crust and the mantle got thicker, the pressure on the fluid magma in the core was greater. And at weaker points in the Earth, where the overlying mantle and substrata and surface strata were weaker, there was a series of upthrusts because the magma wanted to escape. Mountains were formed, and the Earth's crust fractured, and it's at this time that the mineral forming solutions, and I'm going to read this bit because I rather like it. After the Upper Carboniferous came the Hercynian orogeny, and that's before the Permian period, and this was a period of crustal disturbance and mountain building, during which the hydrothermal mineral veins in this region were formed by hot magmatic intrusions rich in water. And I should have also written, and very high in pressure as well. As these rose within the crust and cooled, the individual minerals crystallized out. They don't look like crystals now, but they crystallized out. And the result was a very, very unpredictable type of vein structure. It's not a solid rib of lead. It's not the other one was a solid rib of gangue mineral. It's usually a mixture of blobs, little strings, and one thing and another. Some veins were very rich. That's what I'm trying to say. And some veins were marginal, and some veins were poor and not worth working. This nice countryside that we live in really owes its shape and topography to more recent events in the form of ice ages. As the ice retreated and the meltwater flowed all over the place, the essence, if you like, of these valleys was formed, it was created. Erosion's gone on since in a much, much smaller way, and it's still actually carrying on today. This erosion would actually expose some of the mineral veins on surface. Although what we must remember is that this area was much more wooded than it is now. A lot of scrub, woodland, and this sort of thing. So it would only be on the scars on the valley sides that these veins would be obvious. And the first workings, no doubt, possibly Roman, possibly not, in early years, pre-medieval anyway, was certainly by open cast working. And this is where I'm going to have a little rant. We've all heard about hushing, whereby we are told by some people that vast quantities of water released from dams on the hilltop rushed down the hillside and gouged out the veins and all the country rock around it, and so they could work the vein. Well, that's nonsense. Absolute nonsense. Somebody's been walking today on the fells. Apart from a few dams which were constructed later to run machinery, you've all walked these fells, you've all walked on tops of these hushes. Has anybody seen any big dams? You won't, because there aren't any. No, these are open cast workings, mainly. And I'll tell you how I think they were worked. There were dams, yes. Small dams, which filled up on the moors over the winter with the little streams and runners. And when the miners with the picks and the bars had loosened the bottom and taken what ore they could, possibly some of these dams were big enough to wash some of the rock debris down and get rid of it and expose the vein again in the bottom. But what they were more likely to have been used for, and there is evidence of this, Tannerake, Hushinart and Gasdale being one case, what the water would do, they would let the water trickle down the outcrop in the bottom of the hush, and they would catch it in places and use it for dressing the ore. Remember, that in the medieval times, and right up to the 16th, 17th century anyway, if you could mine enough good ore to fit in a bucket you could carry out, you'd make a bloody good living. It was almost sort of like gold. It was very, very valuable. And people didn't need to mine a lot to make money. I just put this in to illustrate. Could you ever see water out of a dam? Carving that out? It'd have to be 3 times as big as Lady Bower Reservoir and it wouldn't make an impression on it. It's the main lime. It's not going to do anything to it, hardly. The Ice Ages struggled to move some of the harder rock. No, they're open casts, basically. Moving on. The first efforts to go underground in this area, as in most others actually, were to sink little shafts on tops of the vein. Some of these veins had been proved by hushing. This is actually off a book about Derbyshire. And these shafts were not very deep, although jack rolls you could lift with a couple of strong lads and sometimes longer handles and 4 men on it. They would wind from 200 feet. That's not a good slide, and certainly the dress underground is not recommended for everyday use. But that is a copy of, that is an example of a kibble almost exactly like the one in that last slide. And that's in many, many years ago in the late 1960s, 68, 69 I think, and that's in Blind Gill level, near the top of Gunnerside Gill. As time went by, it's a bit blurred is this, I'm afraid, it's very, very unused, rare photograph. As time went by and things got mechanised a bit more, and this is really what the essence of the talk's about, horse gins were introduced. There, and I think on the other side you can't quite, oh yes, and there's another arm there, is where those are the shafts for the horse. And there may be one on the other side, but it's sort of hidden. And the horse went round. The reason for the big drum, of course, is that horses, especially when under load, don't walk very fast. And if the drum had been much smaller, the winding rate would have been extremely low. The shaft, I'm going to try and use it, the shaft is there behind that grid. There's a couple of blokes standing there, and there's the sheave wheel. The rope passes over the sheave wheel down the shaft. And these were in use in the Dales until quite late, actually, in places, but not here, and there's a reason for that. Mechanisation started in Swaledale. Mechanisation as we know it, I would say, started in Swaledale in the early 19th century, apart from underground, and I'm coming to that. This is Lane End Mine, above Keld, in the bottom, and it's the most westerly mine of any note on the North Swaledale mineral belt. The shaft's covered over now with some bits of pump column there, and the thing that looks like a chimney with a hole in it at the back is a ventilation column, because at that time they only had one shaft, one means of ingress and one means of getting out. This new one is an interesting little bit of stuff because it's slightly smaller in diameter than the other bits of pump column. There'll be loads more, by the way. The shaft's about 300 foot deep. That's a working barrel. That's where one of the clack buckets in the pump. You know what a well pump looks like, you know, when you fill the buckets or anything from a well. They're just the same, only instead of one valve on the pump spear, there were a number of them because the valve wouldn't be able to hold the full weight of 300 foot of water, would it? So there'd be intermediate ones going up. And this is one of the barrels in which one of those ran probably at about 3 or 4 feet stroke. And that there is where the inspection door bolted on, which you could take off and they were what they called had a knock-off joint, and you could take out the clack valve to service the leathers. But it's the engine house really I want to talk about. It's very small, it looks like a house, the front wall is quite thick, but not of substantial construction. Quite small ashlar blocks there. And if you look carefully, there's some rebates there in the sides. Now, it's not a Cornish pump. Anybody who thinks, have been to Cornwall and thinks about Cornish pumps will remember that they have a very substantial bob wall at the side of, or front, if you like, nearest the shaft, to support the beam, which on one end had the piston from a cylinder, and on the other end had the dry spear rods going down the shaft. Some of those beams alone, never let alone anything else, weighed 50 tonne. Well, I wouldn't like to put 50 tonnes on that wall. So, what do you think it was? Was it even a steam engine? Well, we'll have to have a look. I told you I'd keep doing that, Ian. Yes, I think it was a steam engine because you can see where the boiler houses have been. There. They were built fairly low pressure boilers. We know the engine was bought second hand and it started work somewhere about 1830 and ran to about 1840, and we also know that it came from the northeast of England. Now that's the clue to this engine house. The northeast of England housed a fella called Phineas Crowther. I don't know whether anybody heard of him. He's not really that well known, but he was a pioneer in stationary engines. Crawley Incline at Stanhope, where you go up out of Stanhope over back towards Edmund Byers, is the winding engine in York Railway Museum from one of those, or is it Wetherill? I can't remember, it's one of the two. And that is a Crowther engine, and it looked something like this. As you can see, it's self-supporting because the flywheel, winding drum, and mind you, are supported on a timber A-frame. It won't be exactly like this. This is a drawing I've adapted from a Frank Atkinson drawing in a book. And you can see the rope goes down the shaft and the pumping, the shaft's near to the engine house, by the way. So this pumping arrangement here worked in stages off the crosshead, would be longer, and the bear would probably be outside somewhere in the shaft about here. But nevertheless, this engine pumped and wound, and I am 90% sure that the engine at Lane End was a Crowther engine. Of course, when you get to steam and you start getting mechanised, you can use man-sized kibbles. You don't have to use these piddly little things that aren't much bigger than a bucket. I mean, a kibble like that would hold a ton of ore at the specific gravity of galena, providing it wasn't mixed with too much gang mineral. Before we leave steam, there were some more steam engines in the Dale. There was supposedly one on the Brandy Bottle Incline up Hard Level Gill. Whether it ever got going or not, I don't know, but it was one of Fred Hall's projects. He's the one who sank the Brandy Bottle Inclines in the early 19th century, and another couple of inclines as well up Hard Level Gill. And he had big ideas. There's also was an engine which I know absolutely nothing about, and I don't think anybody else knows either, at Wetshaw in Artengastdale. There's a huge pile of clinker up there, far too big to have come from any houses and far too big to have come from a smithy. So I'm deducing that there was an engine there, maybe worked on a surface incline, because there are several surface inclines, come out of Wetshaw, over the top, and down the other side to Danby. And it may have worked one of them. But before we leave Steam, we'll go to Hurst. These two shafts, the nearest one, Cat shaft, and the furthest one, Brown shaft, were both sunk in the 1880s by well, it has two names actually, but we'll call it the Yorkshire Mining Company. It's also called the Hurst Mining Syndicate. They were a group of local men who formed a company and rented the mines off a chap called Morley, who was Lord of the Manor at Marwick. And they spent a lot of money. And they sank both these shafts between, well, Cat shaft was the first. If you want to know which is, if you ever go to Hurst and you think, well, I wonder which is which. Oh, bugger it. That one there is a square chimney, so the sides are flat. Flat is Cat. The far one is a round chimney, and Brown's is round. And that's the way to work them out. And they were both sunk in the 1880s. Cat shaft, the nearest one, pumped and wound, with a horizontal steam engine. And Brown shaft just pumped. Two more steam engines were also installed at Hurst, and I'm getting ahead of myself here. But there was a steam engine on the dressing floors at Queen level, and there was also a steam engine which can't have worked for more than 2 or 3 months, running rock drills in Brown shaft, sinking Brown shaft. It was put in 1889, and by December 1889 the company had gone into liquidation. So, yeah, come in, you're right. That's the end of the steam engine saga in the Dales, in these Dales anyway. What about development? Driving levels, sinking shafts, working the ore, stoping the ore. This is a part of a woodcut-in, a book by Georgius Agricola, which literally means farmer, but it was first published in Basel, in Germany, Saxony, in 1556, I think. And I venture to suggest that any of the miners in Artengastdale and Swaledale in the 19th century would have recognised most of these tools. Been very, very little change in hand tools. F and G are wedges, C and B the pick heads, A's a smaller pick head, D's a sort of a gad for putting into wedging into rocks, cracks in rocks to break bits off. And just excuse me a minute. It's not changed that much. What did change, of course, through the years, and especially into the 18th century, was techniques for creating steel from wrought iron increased fourfold. So tools tended to stay sharper. I don't know, and I don't know whether anybody here knows, and I'd like them to tell me if they do, when in mining people started drilling holes in rock to put wedges in, plugs and feathers, call them what you like, to wedge bits off, to drive headings, etc. We do know, of course, that the medieval and pre-medieval stonemasons knew the technique. They used to drill lines of holes in rocks to split off blocks for dressing, for building castles and cathedrals and other things of high status. So the technique was known. The holes were also, by the way, very short, as were the first holes to be drilled in mines. This is because the tools could not be steeled well enough not to lose gauge. I'm coming to some drills anyway in a bit. And of course, once the drill loses gauge, you've got to put a smaller one in and a smaller one in. And the holes are fairly small anyway. Oh, let's see what the next slide is. Here we are. This is what happened in the 19th century. When did this first start? I don't know. I just literally don't know. But I'm guessing that it was sometime about the Elizabethan period, late 16th century. Some German miners came over to the Lake District, into the copper mines. They may have brought the technique with them, but certainly they didn't bring the use of explosives with them. These are three Cornish miners. I think the fella in the middle, some of you know him, might be related to Jeff Clegg. If you look. This is the hardest work. In granite, drilling uppers, double jacking, as they called it. There wasn't much double jacking in the jails, it was all single jacking, by the way. It was just a single hammerman. Not very heavy hammers, about £7 head on them, if that. Especially when drilling uppers. In granite, maybe a foot an hour, if you're lucky with the good steel and good strikers. In limestone, maybe a couple of foot an hour, if you're looking very, again, with good steels and good strikers. These are the sort of tools that were in common use here in the 18th century, anyway. Two drills at the top. The thing on the left's a drilling hammer. They came, those top three came from Ralph Level in Arkngasdale years ago. The long thing underneath is a scraper for scraping the dust out of the holes, very important. The thing below the little labels is a needle. That was used for shoving through the clay stemming, which was put in by the object below it, which is called a beater. People call them a stemmer, a rammer, or whatever they call them. Round here they were called beaters. We know that because they were mentioned in the 1862 Kinnaird report when they interviewed many of the mine agents around here, and they described how it was done. And just as an aside, one of the people in the commission said, "What, you use iron tools for stemming?" And he said, "Aye." He said, "If they're of good iron, they'll never strike a spark." I have my doubts myself. And in the end of this tool, if you like, there is a little notch there, and the needle fits into that notch. So when you've put your charge in the hole, about a third depth, no more, your hole's in the wrong place if you have to fill it up. About the third depth, you will fill it with clay stemming, and at intervals, put the beater in and strike it to compress the stemming. Once you've done that, you insert the beater through the little notch in the end, which is a little bit of room in the hole to insert the needle through, right through the stemming into the powder. And you pull it out, just give it a lick to make sure it's in the powder. You can taste the powder, don't put it in again because it's wet. And from then on you can put a squib in. And they would use squibs until after 1831, when this stuff was invented. No, not that. Go back. The coil of fuse on the left was invented. Squibs were made various ways, using rushes, cutting rushes open and scraping the pith out, filling them with very finely ground powder, closing them up again, and finishing them off with candle wax. Paper could be wrapped around the knitting needle drawn out, and the resulting hole filled with very fine powder. The problem is they're not reliable, and they burn them pretty fast. Safety fuse, one of my first big advances in technology, in mining, strangely enough, apart from steam engines, of course, so far. It's a safety fuse. There's a bit of safety fuse. Got plenty at home if you want some. And it burns at 30 seconds a foot. 30 seconds a foot. That should be on your mind all the time. Because at least you know, once you measured that, with a stick, they don't take rulers, but they would have a stick. And then once you've measured that, you know exactly how long you've got to get out. Safety fuse into the powder, away, and hopefully you'll manage to draw a bit of ground. Then, what happened? Well, in the early 19th century, I'm going to just put my glasses on here because I just need to do it. Right. By the way, Roger Bacon said to have introduced gunpowder into Britain in the 13th century. He was a monk. What's he doing? Messing about with gunpowder? We don't know when it was first used in blast holes in mines, explosives. But I can tell you this, that the first recorded use of gunpowder in mining was in Swaledale near Massa, about 1720. Forgot to tell you that before. A fellow called Sobrero in Italy in 1847, spelt like the hat but without an M, invented nitroglycerin, but he didn't know what to do with it. He hadn't a clue what to do with it, but at least he managed not to blow himself up, because his raw nitro is pretty nasty. It's very, very sensitive. Now, there's a fella, I know we have somebody from Sweden in the audience, and they'll be pleased to know that Alfred Nobel actually first tamed nitroglycerin, and this is the product that he made. Found in Devish Hall several years ago now at Grinton. Dynamite. And he first made it on a barge in Sweden in 1868, which was a year after he invented it. How did he tame nitroglycerin? Well, it was very simple, really. He absorbed it on a diatomaceous earth, which is a sort of clay. The Germans call it Kieselguhr, and it's very absorbent, and it absorbs the nitro, so it can be used, and it also very convenient makes it into a shape that it can be pushed into, it can be charged into shot holes as well. Problem with dynamite, and I'm talking from personal experience here, is that over a while, when that pile with those sticks sit like that, and they've only been there since about 1889, and this was picture was taken about 10 years ago, I would think, the nitro migrates out of the Kieselguhr, and it slowly leaves it and runs onto the ground. And eventually, they also sticks of people say, oh, you don't touch dynamite, don't, and you still don't touch it really. But in actuality, all that would be those inside, those wrappings, as you can see, it's got Alfred Nobel Glasgow written on it, because he started his first works in Ardea in 1871. And all go back to what I was saying, all that happens with that dynamite is you just end up with a stick of white diatomaceous earth. And the gelignite migrates, and there have been accidents. Over the years, it will actually migrate into the and it wouldn't go off. But there have been accidents when it first started being used, especially into Cornwall, with it washing out of holes in water and ended up in puddles, and actually being set off. So, following dynamite, Alfred Nobel was still busy, and he actually introduced the first gelatinous explosive. I should say that gun cotton was invented in 1847. It's a weird explosive as well. It's nitroglycerine absorbed into cotton wool, essentially. Nitrocellulose, got it right. It was first manufactured in a factory in Britain in 1847 in Faversham in Kent. And the bloody thing blew up completely. And in the newspaper articles, they were very, very quick to point out that it had decimated an area of 4 acres. In the next paragraph, they actually just happened to mention it killed 18 people. But that was and nitrocellulose was actually banned. Gun cotton, the manufacture was banned. The manufacture of nitroglycerine was banned in England, but it wasn't banned in Scotland. So Alfred Nobel built a factory at Ardea. It says Glasgow there, but you know, near enough. They built a factory in Ardea in, I think, 1871. And he started a company called the British Dynamite Company, and it was eventually called just Nobel's Explosives. Incidentally, the first dynamite store, as far as I know, permanent dynamite store, is in Arkngasdale. It was built in 1872, so they were fairly quick off the ground, weren't they? And it's still there. If you go out over the cattle grid, the top of the dale, going out towards Tan Hill, and you look on the left, you'll see it stuck up on a hillside. Cost 20 quid when it was built. So we'll go back to blasting gelatine. And that's what it is. And blasting gelatine is nitroglycerine compounded, which it does do to a certain extent, with a form of nitrocellulose gun cotton called collodion, which is also used in photography, actually, or was used in photography. And it's actually, I think nitroglycerine is about what? It's only 2.5% collodion, but it makes it into a gel which stabilises it. And for an absorbent, gelignite uses wood meal. And there's various other nitrates, potassium nitrate and sodium nitrate in small quantities mixed in with it. They act as a catalyst, actually, rather than they do provide oxygen, but they also act as a catalyst. Then you might wonder, well, can you set dynamite off with a fuse? Well, actually, you can, but it generally only burns because there is no detonation rate. There isn't enough energy. So, it's again, we've got Alfred Nobel again here. And he was messing about trying to detonate nitroglycerine before he invented dynamite. And in the process of doing this, he invented the mining detonator, which fits on the end of safety fuse and is crimped on. Detonators using lead azide, which these do as an explosive agent, were first invented, as some of you probably know, as percussion caps for muskets in the early, and it struck with a hammer and it went bang. But these also used lead azide. Those are a little bit later. The lead azide is quite dangerous and quite sensitive. And later it was reviewed, sorry, not lead azide, mercury fulminate was first used, then lead azide replaced it. So, a little bit about explosives. Why do we go on about explosives? Because as explosives improved, so did the rate of mining. Imagine you've got some gunpowder in a hole which will just about do what it's supposed to do. It'll fire the corner. There's no point in me going on and drilling a bloody hole in this wall here, 4 foot deep, charging it. I won't stand there, go around the corner and firing it. What's going to happen? It's just going to blow back like a gun. You've got to have a free face to do it. So you've got to create a hole to blow into by drilling holes in a sort of a pattern or finding a backer joint in the rock which you can actually drill to at the back and it will shoot it out. And of course, at this time, there were no delay detonators. So unless you could make sure that the fuse was burning in your first hole, so in your second hole, before your first hole went off, you were in great danger of getting cut off holes and your second hole would miss. So it was a great skill firing more than one hole with that sort of drilling at this time. We talked about shafts. If you look up here, some little, oh by the way, that's that hush I took the photograph in, the deep one, Stoddart hush. It was worked until the 1880s sporadically by the Stoddart family, George Stoddart and partners. Some little pimples up there, shafts, probably just ordinary jack roller shafts, maybe horse steam, we don't know. But these are the things which opened the field up for us. Horse levels. That's old moulds, or the hillocks, as it's known locally. And that was started in 1802. And it had miles of horse levels. That doesn't say you can get through to Gunnerside Gill. At one time you could, but not by horse level. You had to climb up and down a bit, and then you were going to hard level, and then from hard level you would go through into Bunting, and then come out in Gunnerside Gill. What's the advantage of them? Well, there are many. Think about it. Those levels, 6'6" high above the rails and about 3'6" wide. You can get a good horse in them. You're not bound to the little pit gallows they use underground in the collieries at that time and for a long time after. They go uphill just slightly, 1 in 200, 1 in 300, sometimes steeper because they wanted to rise for some reason or another. Water runs out. So anything above you that you want to work will be drained automatically. You don't have to worry about pumping down to that level. Then, of course, you've got the other issue. You've got to breathe. If you have an adit meeting a shaft, you've got 8 times out of 10 what we would call a motive column. If the mine is colder than the outside temperature, and the mine temperature usually about 52 Fahrenheit, something like that. If the mine temperature is colder, as in winter, the warmer air on surface would slowly sink down the shaft and it would cool. And as it cooled, it would sink slightly faster. And when it had nowhere to go at the bottom, it would come out of the level mouth. So it would do that. It's like a U-tube really, but part of the U-tube's in the air, it's outside. And of course, in the winter, I've got that wrong now. Let's start again. In the winter, the mine's warmer than the outside, so air rises through the mine. In the summer, the air's colder in the mine, so it falls through the mine. And that natural ventilation, and that was relied on, apart from in closed headings where they had little hand-driven windy kings or fans. And that was what they needed in quiet weather, or wind helps as well sometimes, but in quiet weather, and when the temperature underground and on surface is about the same, you didn't get very good ventilation at all. So you've got haulage, drainage, ventilation, and, very important, these horse levels are often driven from the valley sides. Well, they were driven from the valley sides. And in the valleys there's water all year round most of the time. And you can use that water for dressing your ore. So you're handy when you come out of the mine for your dressing floors. You can build dressing floors at the level mouth, there's some there. And you can lead water to them from the streams and the becks in conduits, in open launders. So I can't stress how much those opened up mining fields in this country, especially around here. Because getting to the tops of the moors is a little bit awkward, to say the least, it still is. That's the low-level goose nest in Art and Gasdale. And you can see what I mean about drainage. That's the lowest level on the south side of the Blackside vein, which is a huge south downthrow fault, about 250 to 280 feet. And this takes all the water out of the Geordie syncline. It wasn't very productive for ore, but it does a good job draining the field. It used to be Reeth water supply, didn't it? And then they decided there was too much lead in it. Now they pump it up and there's too much chlorine in it. Well, you can't win. Oh, come on, Pillock. I'll just go back one. I might have gone up over 2. Oh, it didn't come up. Never mind, that doesn't matter. We'll talk about it anyway. I don't know why that didn't come up because it's on mine. Rails, different sorts of rails. Wooden rails were probably used in Germany with sort of flat planks laid down in the Harz Mountains in the 16th century. And the first wooden, I just have to get me a piece of paper here because I like to get these dates right. The first wooden railway, this might surprise you actually, was recorded in the Nottinghamshire coalfield in 1604. We don't know what sort of rails they were. There might have been just ordinary block oak rails, or they might have been angled. And the first one in the northeast was recorded in 1621. First iron wheels were cast in Coalbrookdale in 1729. We don't know whether they had flanges on or they were just biscuit wheels, what we call biscuit wheels, cart wheels, which ran on flat plates. But we can certainly say that by 1800, wooden oak rails with flanged wheels, the same as you see today on the railways, were common in the northeast of England by 1800, and that's probably almost certainly true, and it started being used in lead mines as well by then. But because 1 horse pulls 8 tons on a level iron road, 3 tons on wooden rails, and 1 ton on a good road on surface, not tarmac, just ordinary macadam's road, there's a great incentive to invent something better than wooden rail. And certainly this was done. And the first plate, that's angle iron rails, and edge rails, which are sort of rails in a way that we know today, were actually laid in South Wales in 1786. The shortest length of edge rail was cast at 7 foot length. Sorry, the longest was 7 foot and the shortest was 3 foot. The thing with cast iron rails is you can't bend them. They're too brittle. So if you wanted to go around corners, you could only use the 3 foots, and there was enough play in the chairs or pedestals that fixed the rail sat in on the sleepers to make a little bit of a turn. So you could jag your way around the turn using 3 foot lengths. And in later years when the coin came out, these were called threepenny bit curves. You can see why. Not very good cast iron rail for many, many reasons. Brittle, doesn't take a lot of load, as Richard Trevithick found out when he tried his Penny Darren locomotive in, was it 1802? It kept breaking rails, it was too heavy. So, in 1820, although they were produced a little bit earlier than this, between 1805 and 1808, in the good old North East, John Birkinshaw in 1820 made a patent and started up a steam-powered mill for wrought iron and fish belly rail. Now you see a lot of fish belly rail in these mines still, and basically what it is, they have a 3 foot length which is thicker in the middle between the chairs. They still come in long lengths, so a 12 foot would have 4 lots of fish bellies and the chairs fit in the narrow bits. The fish bellies take the weight between the chairs. The problem with that is you can't put your sleepers anywhere, and underground that can be a problem. You can only put them where the rail tells you can put them. The T-rail, which is what I'm bending there, and the section of it is just like a T, literally, when you look at the end of it. You can put your chairs your chairs and your sleepers and anywhere on that, apart from the joints, of course. You've got to be able to put them on the joints where you had wider chairs. So it's a lot more sensitive, a lot more convenient, rather, for underground use. It's damn difficult sometimes on curves underground bending rail. You take the longer length of rail, the better, because you get further, and you don't have the joints to mess on with. But imagine bending a fairly tight curve of rail underground, and you've got to start on the straight and then bend the inside rail around the curve first and feed it around the curve as you do it. Always bend the inside rail first, because you have more room when you're doing the outside to put your rail bender on. The inside rail, you can't put your rail bender on in situ. You've got to actually take it out somewhere else to bend it. The choke marks, by the way, make sure that the bends, that the actual pressure, it's just like a little clamp with a screw jack. The actual pressure on that are more or less kept the same and the same distance apart. And when you come, once you've bent it a little bit, if you want to bend it a little bit more, you come back in between your choke marks and do it again until you end up with the radius of curve that you want. But again, I cannot stress the importance of metal rail for transport. It revolutionised mining in this area. There were no high-speed winders or anything like that. But it got the job done. Just a quick look at some in situ underground. Punchy Gill mine out in Garthdale, a wooden turn rail, set of wooden points, 4-inch square oak. Probably been there since 1848, 1850, something like that. This is a good one. This is strap rail. If you look near John's knee there, you can see that there's an iron strap on top of a wooden rail. And the interesting thing about this, it's quite a tight turn. That wood will either have to be steam bent or shaped to fit that turn, and then the iron strap's put on top. It's a sort of a halfway house, if you like, between wooden rails and iron rails. And of course, the beauty of it is, if the wrought iron strap wore out, you could replace it. But again, until rolling mills were invented that could produce long strips of this stuff, they all had to be blacksmith made. So, you know, once iron rails came in, that sort of thing didn't live long. I would say that's probably again about 1840, something like that. Clog marks and boot that marks. I was telling you about fish belly. Well, that's a bit of fish bellied rail. It's cast iron rail sitting in chairs, where the chairs are there. There's a 3-foot length, another chair there, and there's your fish belly in between them to support the weight. Very heavy gauge, but very brittle. And that's T-rail, sitting in chairs in bunting level. I'm sure you've probably been in there. Bit of water coming out. We'll talk about bunting level water in a bit. And there's some decent, the chairs are cast iron, rails are wrought iron. Faggy Hill Mine main crossing, no chairs at all. Modern, 1870s, flat bottom rail. Nailed straight onto the sleeper using dogs or plate nails if the flanges of the rail, the bottom flanges are drilled, which they often were in those days. Now they don't seem to bother. Are not always laid in horse haulages. I've got to do hand tramming as well, and this is a 1-foot gauge rail, smaller section rail, some tiny section, quite light rail, and that's in Devis Hall Mine, above Grinton Smelt Mill. Transport. Well, we've always got the ubiquitous barrow, I mean, this isn't actually particularly very old. It probably dates from the 1920s, and it's actually taken at Nent Head, is this, in the Villa Montaigne Stopes in Rampgill. So they don't take any more explanation whatsoever. Once the idea of running something on smooth, flat surfaces came in, you got things like this one. Bad to see, I know, but it's a tiny little cart, much denuded, with blacksmith-made round biscuit wheels without flanges and a pair of clogs to boot. And that would run just on planks, flat planks. And that was probably in Buckden Mine in the 1860s, so primitive. But they did have horse haulage in the main level. This wooden wagon from Story Level on Greenhow Hill dates from probably 1820, before wrought iron plates were, well, they were expensive, let's put it that way, so they make it out of timber. And it is, if you like, you can regard as a forerunner of the type of horse wagons that we've got today, like that. This is in the end of the Black Crosscut in Hard Level in Swaledale. Note the horns which stick out at both ends. That's for connecting the wagons together with chains. They didn't have a central coupling like railway vehicles do today. They had a chain each side. When you went round the curve, the outside one went tight and the inside one went slack. And some of the tracks were so bad, it helped to pull, to actually give the wagons a lead into the turns, so that they wouldn't ride, the flanges wouldn't ride over. This is quite near here. This is 1908 at Stang. I'll be going back over there in a bit and see Stang House somewhere. There, look. There's Stang House. This chap here, Thomas Harker, Martin Gasdale, his son Wesley used to play the organ in the chapel down here. And he was agent for the Stang and Cleasby Mining Company, which didn't last particularly long. That's another talk in itself. 4 horse wagons, and they have a most peculiar way of gating up. The horse, from the horse harness, the chain goes all the way along, all the way along, all the way along, and all the way to the back tubs. There's no connection between the tubs at all. Never come across that before, and I often wonder how it ran, to be quite honest. But there must have been a reason for it. I talked about horses before. Note the size of that horse. That's Tom Peacock, almost certainly. He actually had the tramming contract at the time. Look at the horse. It's as high as his shoulders at least. Dale's pony, good strong horse. So if that train, that set, a rake, if you would call it what you like, of tubs or wagons was full, there would be a 8 ton. But it wouldn't be, because I think the track was probably so bad that I would have thought they would have had a bit less in it than that, because you get 2 ton of good ore in one of those wagons. And there's a little Dirk wagon, or Dirk, Nuthole, Art and Gasdale, now removed. It's a good job because the place is silted up now, so you couldn't get it out anyway. It's in Hawes Countryside Museum. Right, just have a little break, because I've talked about the development of technique, how the field opened up, and how it was actually put on a modern basis. From individual couple, 2 or 3 miners going and taking little leases to work the mines, by the time the mid-19th century came along, companies and partnerships were starting to bid for leases on areas of work rather than little bits of sections of brains which had been worked before, meres if you like to call them that. And we were getting into the modern age now with joint stock companies and this sort of thing that could capitalise. They could afford, or barely afford, to buy equipment to improve either the lot of the miner to improve profitability, hopefully, or at least to do something which you couldn't do any other way, like drain deep shafts, for instance. So this, we can say at least from 1800, things started to sort of see the beginnings of the modern age in mining. So I've just been letting you have a look at that. It's basically a layout. It's come from another talk by Mike Gill, actually. The little blue dot here, there's the Keld Resource Centre here. There's that was Lane End. And we're going to look at the hydraulic engine craze. More mechanisation in Swaledale than you might think. And it's due basically down to 2 or 3 people, literally, that this took place. We're not talking about hydraulic engines first, we're going to talk about this water wheel that was put in underground in 1837 in Blake's mine at the top of Gunnerside Gill, which is in Blake's Beck actually. I said that water wheels, I've really touched on water wheels, but water wheels have not been used very much at all for winding shafts in Swaledale and out in Garthdale. Odd one. Why? Because most of the shafts are on the moor top, aren't they, by definition? Most of them, not all of them, as we'll see. There isn't enough water to run a decent sized water wheel up there on a reliable basis. Hence they tended to go for horse gins. And the reason that there isn't enough water to do certain things also contributed to the use of hydraulic engines, as we will see. But at Blake's mine in the 1830s, the main lime, which as I've already said was the best hose stock for galena, started to dip below the horse level. That's a very bad condition plan. I've got to clarify the one of that. So they put in a 38-foot diameter water wheel. Sorry, I'm thinking of one. 29-foot diameter water wheel with a 3-foot breast. And it operated pumps in an engine sump. And the engine sump is there. Notice there's still a hand-wound winder, jack roll, for raising the ore. It didn't do any winding, it just did pumping. Water was brought in from surface via 2 leads, one from a dam, which I'll show you in a minute, and one from a stream called Cross Gill, down into Raper level, via a valve, down again. The control valve, by the way, was worked by another jack roller down here. And then into a launder, onto the wheel, and it will be what we call a 2-lift pump system. Both those columns there, because there's 2 columns, one set of rods is up and the far one is down. I'll state it now so I don't have to say it again, that these pumps would lift water in 2 stages. The first stage goes to a cistern halfway up the shaft. The second stage lifts it from a cistern to surface. I can give you probably a few details here on the scale of it. We reckon that the maximum speed of the water wheel at that diameter would normally be about 3.5 to 4 revolutions per minute, not per second, per minute. And at that rotation with a 3-foot breast, the water requirement will be, this is not to fill the buckets. You don't fill the buckets. The buckets have to be between 1/4 and 1/3 full. Otherwise, too much water spills out as it's going round. That's basically all the wheel can hold. Otherwise, you're wasting water. But at that bucket fill, that wheel would consume 98,600 gallons an hour. an awful lot of water. And if you measure that up and scale it up over the distance scale by the diameter of the pumps and the stroke on the pumps and the revolutions on the wheel, you can work out that with a double lift of pumps, 98,600 gallon an hour feed on the wheel raised 9,400 gallons from 204 feet. That's all. It wasn't using the full horsepower of the wheel, but basically they should have had slightly bigger pumps, but they didn't. The diameter of the pumps is what they are, and that's it, and the stroke's what they are. So you can see now a little bit better the two leads coming in, which I've drawn in by pencil, down the water shafts, into raper level, down a sump, then a control valve at the top. The dark line is a dam, the water in the dam, let all the way down there and onto the wheel, which is an overshot wheel. Those are Blake's dams. At some time, that huge dam, the top one, silted up a lot. And they fed water to it. Forget that. Originally, the leak went along there, the water course went on there, from Moss Dams along the long race, which is 2.5 miles long, from the watershed virtually, between Gunnerside Gill and Swinnergill, where the Moss Dams are. It was a hell of a blooming undertaking. Just to mind me to lead. Anyway, we'll talk about the low dam later. That's the high dam. Before 2019, when there was a huge flood which breached it, and there's a huge hole in it. Incidentally, I was told the other day that the dam was intact all around the top until 1964 when it was first breached, and it breached the low dam at the same time. That's the valves that let the water in from raper level. But that was some time ago. It's a horrible dirty hole. The winds that the water goes down, the sump if you like, is choked, you can't get down it. That's the engine house where the water wheel chamber. And John sat on the steps going down, and Pete's leaning on one of the piers which supported the launder to feed the water wheel. And I don't know, I think this might be overkill. I've put him on again. There he is. This is a fantastic arch, which actually, for some reason, very big, and I cannot see the reason for it, actually. We're going up out of the horse level there into the water wheel chamber. The great pile of shale on the left fills both the water wheel chamber and the pump chamber. It's a right mess, unfortunately. But that was a precursor, and there's a lot of work in it. Right, I think this slide slipped a bit, it doesn't matter. Whittam's hydraulic engine, Blake's weight. In 1842, a chap called Christopher Lonsdale Bradley, whose father was the mayor of Richmond at the time, had a lease on, was working Blake's Weight mine to the west of where that water wheel's situated underground. And the water wheel was, I'm not surprised at 9,800 gallon an hour, but the limestone was dipping westwards, and I'm afraid the pumps became strangled. They couldn't cope any longer. So I had to think what I was going to do. So he sunk another sump, and he had the idea of putting in a hydraulic engine, which uses far less water than the water wheel did. And for some reason, which I can get a little bit close to, but I can't quite fathom, he got hold of a chap called William Whittam from Huddersfield, who had been dabbling with hydraulic machinery since the 1830s, and he asked him to put the engine in. Well, what's the connection between Kit Lonsdale Bradley and William Whittam? Bradley's wife was born in Huddersfield, or near Huddersfield, in a neighbouring parish to William Whittam. Bradley's wife's parents had a woolen mill called Stonybank Mill in Wooldale Township, near Huddersfield rather. And William Whittam had started his life as an engineer in woolen mills. So there is a very, very good sort of bloodline there, if you like. There's been some sort of connection. However, William Whittam got involved. And we'll just look at what the advantage, or otherwise, is between the two means of motive power. Let you have a little look at that for a minute. You can see the main thing is there, nearly a ninth of the water on that theoretical model there. Neither of those things exist as such. They are just designed to create the same horsepower. The calculations. So basically, the hydraulic engine uses a ninth of the water. But there are other advantages as well. There's one or two disadvantages. The first, I'll deal with them first. The first disadvantage is the cost. A water wheel of that diameter would cost probably somewhere about £38–40 in those days. By the way, if I mention financial figures, pounds, just add 2 notes for today. So at 380 becomes 38,000, etc. The hydraulic engine, probably at that time, well, Whittam put one in, so and we know it costs £500 for pumping and winding. So that's 50,000. I think that's quite cheap, actually. It's a lot more compact. Look at the huge engine room and wheel case that had to be put in for the Victoria engine. These are tiny little things. That's more or less sort of to scale as well. You don't need huge water leaks on surface because you don't need as much water. You don't need as big a dams. So taken all for all, there was a lot of advantages in installing hydraulic engines at that time. There's a water wheel, basically. I was talking about buckets, wasn't I? That's a backshot wheel. It will be fed from the other side part way down. There's always big arguments on what's the most efficient way of doing it. That's at hose, by the way. That's how you feed a hydraulic engine. So the snifting valve is also, that's a little, that pipe would rise just slightly, that little short length of pipe. It would let any air out that was trapped in there, and it would also act as a safety valve. The reason why they're so much more efficient, of course, is that the energy is due to the pressure in the pipe and the head. A water wheel just takes an open flow of water, and that's all you can calculate it at. Weight of water times the height that it falls. Here, you've got confined water in a pressure pipe. Heads, well, we'll come to that, but heads somewhere, anywhere between 150 and 300 feet. Sometimes a bit more. This is what happened when they put the Blake's-Waite engine in. You can see the limestone dipping underneath the horse level, which is a big brown line. The Whittam engine's on the west side, going towards West Stonesdale. The water was brought from the low dam into Lonsdale level and down to the engine. We know a bit about this engine because Whittam put an advert in the Leeds Mercury, actually. It's supposed to be an article, but they wrote them as an article, but they were really an advert. And the engine itself was a beam engine, rather like a beam steam engine. And it's probably maybe the only one of those, that type, that there was, because he improved them later. We'll see in a minute. The head from Lonsdale level, where the pipe started, the vertical green line, was 160 feet. Running at 30 revs per minute, they ran very, very slowly. All hydraulic engines run slowly. It raced 7,800 gallons an hour to Blake's main adit, using 24,000 gallons an hour of feed. Pumps, these are my calculations now, pumps therefore consumed 11.5 horsepower, and the winder raised a total load of 800 pounds. That's including the rope, the kibble. It wasn't a cage winder, it was a kibble, and 500 to 600 weights of ore. And for that you want about 4.7 horsepower. So the total output was 16.2 horsepower. So it would be able to run pumping and winding at the same time, because the engine was rated at 19.4 horsepower. And it worked till 1850. And that's the first of the hydraulic ventures. That is the control rod that let the water, it's there, that let the water out of the low dam into Lonsdale level, where it went along and it ponded in Lonsdale level and finally reached a little low dam. We've been in once, it's hellish, been in once, right up to the top of the sump that goes down into the engine chamber, which is choked. The pipes have been removed, but there's a little launder left that fed into the pipes. And that's where the water went into Lonsdale level, along the vein and down into the engine chamber, which incidentally was said to be lined with zinc sheets and lit with candelabras. That's the low dam breached. The rod is on the opposite side of it, somewhere down there, and Mason was standing on the top there. And this is the mouth of Lonsdale level that the water was led into. I believe that dam was breached, he said, 1962 or 64 in a flood. Little Moorfoot, you know where Little Moorfoot is? Hogarth's, Keld, just above Keld, Hogarth's Bridge on the road to Nateby. There's a farm called Hogarth's Farm on the right at the top of a little hill. No? Right. Well, now you're going to find out. That's gone to Finnooch. Yeah, if you're in this field, which is actually a camping field, bit of a sort of cow pasture sort of camping field, you wouldn't know anything existed here at all. There's a little red rucksack, I don't know whether you can see it, I better make sure I press right, there we are, and there's a little gill runs up there, and there's a bush there. Behind that bush is hiding the mouth of the engine tunnel, which was the original adit into the shaft that water was pumped up to, until a later adit called Rumble Pool Level, I love that name, Rumble Pool Level, was driven more or less across underneath, 30 foot below my feet where I'm standing, across into there and into the shaft. The shaft is up there, right on top. Not absolutely certain exactly where the engine house was though. Hogarth's Farm. Hogarth's Farm has a beautiful porch. That porch came off the engine house. It had the bob, where the beam, that is what I would call the bob hole, where the beam came out of the engine house to drive a series of rockers or bobs, angle bob, and down the shaft. Ray Calvert once thought that it actually came from Lane End, that engine house, but his father years ago told me it had definitely come from Little Moorfoot Mine, and in fact it definitely hasn't come from Lane End when you look at the engine house which I've just shown you. This is an old drawing. I did it for a talk. This was done for a talk in 2002 in Aberystwyth. The little inset gives you some idea of basically how I think it was probably driven. And I say it was just an ordinary beam engine, little ordinary beam engine, very low, very small bore, you know. 16-inch bore, 8-inch stroke, these hydraulic engines, not much more. There's the shaft, angle bob, there's the engine tunnel, dotted, coming out, there's the riverbed. And the photograph was taken from that direction, you can see. The water came from Birkdale Tarn along a watercourse to a holding dam. There's the road up to Ravensett. And then down a pressure pipe to the shaft. I can tell you what, the head was quite a lot actually. 330 feet. A chap did a calculation when the AD company were going to take the lease over. And he said this engine isn't very efficient, it's only 22% efficient. But what he'd done, he'd calculated it as if he thought the water came from Birkdale Tarn, which is nearly another 100 foot higher. So he did his calculation based on 430 feet head instead of 330 feet head. As I say, we don't exactly know where the engine house is, but it's in somewhere in this little enclosure, this little intake here. And that photograph that I first showed you with the river was taken from more or less there, where my trembling hand was. So that, yeah, the holding dam isn't very big, is it, Pete? You can hardly blooming see it. But the pressure pipes are probably still in. They show up on a metal detector anyway. In fact, I'm pretty sure they are for another reason. The shaft, which you could at one time access via the engine tunnel, which is now silted up, and unfortunately Pete and I, due to other commitments, have been able to reopen it to take some better photographs. We were hoping that we'll be able to do that before this talk, but we can't. The shaft is arched over, probably about 15 foot from surface, 20 foot from surface, and the engine, I'm standing looking into a sort of a hole because the arching comes back over this way as well. It's almost like a dome. Beautiful arching. That must have been done later, I think. But the spear rod, it's called a cladded dry spear, technically, is that. It's got a wooden core with two iron cladding on the outside, and it runs dry. It doesn't run in the pump barrels. That probably operated the pumps down at Rumble Pool level. From Rumble Pool level, I've forgotten what that was about. The shaft was about 240, something like that, to Rumble Pool. Yeah, something like that, up to Rumble Pool. So the water ran out of Rumble Pool and into the Swale. I reckon basically, although we don't really know what diameter the pipes were, there's odd slides missing on this, I think. Yeah, no, that pipe once fed a DC generator, Pelton Wheel, in the 1950s, that was put in by Raymond's grandfather, I think. I don't think it was his dad, Raymond's grandfather, Raymond Calvert's grandfather. And that's a 4-inch pipe. Now, you might say, oh, well, he'd just shoved it up a 5-inch pipe. Maybe, but it's of the order of diameter, and it makes an awful lot of difference. I cannot stress that more. The flow in these pipes, the diameter, makes an awful lot of difference. And this was what had been the problem here. It was not very efficient at all. And I reckon if we actually do a bit of imagining about the pumps, I would have said they'd race probably about 6,720 gallon an hour from, it's 224 foot to Rumble Pool level, something like that. And that's number 2. Now, we're back to our friend Christopher Lonsdale Bradley and William Whittam again. We don't know that this is a Whittam engine, but pretty sure it would have been. But what we do know is it was a different type. I think I'll just go on to the next slide. If you're driving up drive up Silver Hill out of Swaledale, go up through the little hamlet of West Stonesdale, up towards Stanhill for a pint, you'll see on the right, down in the valley, the side that Jeff's standing at is what you can see from the road, a strange blockhouse arrangement. Massive sandstone, gritstone blocks. It's weird, and you could be forgiven for wondering what it was. Well, it's the engine house of West Stonesdale mine, which housed a hydraulic engine, and the shaft was sunk to work the extension of the Blake's-Waite vein, because the Blake's-Waite hydraulic engine eventually ran out of steam as well, or ran out of water if you like, and it couldn't pump any deeper, but the beds continued to dip. Fortunately, we were dipping towards West Stonesdale, and a crosscut driven from the bottom of this shaft should intersect the Blake's-Waite vein. It might be worth just saying now that he did intersect the Blake's-Waite vein, and on the way they encountered a cross vein which actually bore lead. It was a pure fluke, dead good luck, and it actually paid more or less for the work. Lonsdale Bradley, with all his engines, and there's another one to come in a minute, reckoned, he was telling somebody in the early 1870s before he died, that from all his mining ventures, he'd neither made money nor lost money. I sometimes wonder whether he was bragging or complaining, actually. Anyway, that's the engine house. That's the plan, or a plan. There's Blake's-Waite vein. There's the workings, there's Blake's-Waite main added. There's the workings on the Blake's-Waite vein, east and west engine sumps, and that's as far as they got. So this is the shaft this sunk where the engine houses I've just showed you. Started to cross-cut towards the vein, found a cross vein, worked that, entered into Blake's-Waite vein, totally barren. Unfortunately, hard luck, and that's mining, in those days anyway. I don't know whether you can read this, but it hasn't come out too badly. An inventory was done in 1869 and what was left. I'll just chatter away a little bit while you're in the engine house. So you can more or less work out what the layout was. Never mind about the iron rails, they'll be there forever. You see you've got all the lining for the shaft, the double cylinder hydraulic engine with a broken crank, air blowers for ventilation, because again, there's only one way down and one way up. Double function drawing apparatus, I'll tell you about that now. While that's on, so you've got time to... Double function drawing apparatus is a double function winder. And what I'm pretty sure it means is that it had two winding drums on it, on the same shaft. One had, it says a quantity of new pump brackets, 3 empty corner. It says something about round rope somewhere. And the round rope would be for the kibbles, which I mentioned. And if they ever had any problems with the pump, you can use the kibbles for sinking the shaft further, of course, but you can also use them for bailing. And they'd be very handy for bailing water if the pumps ever let them down. So they could get to the bottom cracks or whatever was wrong down the bottom, strum filter blocked up or whatever, and mend it. So that's the first function. The second function is winding. Now, it was definitely a cage winder. You can see how it's come off. The cage has been brought off onto the waste heaps, just level with the top of the shaft. And the engine, no matter how you calculate it, with the mixture of 4 and 6 inch feed pipes, as it says there, there must have mostly been 6 inch feed pipes, so it couldn't do anything really. The winder for the cage rather, would be like a big Catherine wheel. You know the firework, the Catherine wheel, where you've got a tape wrap round, or a tape measure even, if you like, we could use that analogy. When the rope's paid out down the bottom of the shaft, and the cage is on the bottom, and the horse wagon's in it, it probably wouldn't be a horse wagon, it'd be a hand tramming, they wouldn't get horses down. And the wagon's in it, the rope is very near the centre of the drum. Therefore, the torque on the winder required to start that cage from the standstill is very small. As the cage is drawn up the shaft, the casting wheel or the drum holder fills up with rope, and the cage rises faster and faster and faster and faster until you stop it at the top. But once it's going, it doesn't need as much torque to actually lift that cage, and it doesn't get it either, because the diameter from the centre to where the rope is becomes greater and greater and greater. And that's why flat ropes were used a lot in the early days, when steam winders and water wheels, this sort of thing, just literally didn't have the power to start the load. That's the only advantage, believe me, of a flat rope winder. Right, let's see what the engine looked like. I think this is a contemporary one, put in by Whittam, Stanhope Burn, and it answers perfectly. Twin cylinder hydraulic engine with a broken crank. Well, there's the crank, but it's not broken. These are the twin cylinders, one there and one there. So I think that this would be a very, very similar engine. That's what it would look like, I think. It answers pretty well. There's your cage. I've even put a kibble in the storeroom, look. There's a ventilation column which went through that strange little hole in the back wall, through the wall, which is massive, the wall, absolutely massive, through the wall and down the shaft. The inverted engine working the dual purpose winder and the blower, and also the pumps via some gearing. There's a connecting rods, bell cranks down the shaft. Again, it's a double lift pump. It actually says so this time. One lift goes halfway to a cistern, the second lift brings the water to surface. Basically, it would need twice the power when you think about it if both columns went to the bottom, and it had balanced column like the dual pump. The water came from Mould Gill. Some people say that it came from Frith Tarn, but we've investigated that. And I'm sorry to have to tell you that Frith Tarn's on the wrong side of the hill. Frith Tarn's on the watershed on the Swinigal side of the hill. And they would have had to dig an extremely deep ditch to get the water into Mould Gill. However, there are some water courses not shown on this map coming round the contours here, feeding into Mould Gill. There's where the surface leak came out of Mould Gill into the reservoir, into the pressure pipe and down to the engine. And the head is, so all these figures I have to, was 250 feet. And I think they must have been mostly 6-inch pipes to be able to do what it said it did. There we are, that's, you can see that actually in the place now. Mould Gill, it doesn't carry water all the year by any means. It must have been a very unreliable supply. The dam, you can actually just about see it. It's not the black bit, that's behind it, it's there. Down there, and across a little bridge, which is now washed away partly, and to the engine house. Out, there's the engine house, and there's the arrow, more or less, where the pipes were buried. They aren't there anymore. You know, I said at one time that water wheels for winding were not used very much in the Dale. Well, in this case, this is the exception that proves the rule. You'll notice that both the tips are there, on different levels, aren't they? That one being lower than that one. That one was created from the engine house because the shaft top's there just behind that window that the winding rope went through. The other one is lower down there, and that amount of waste was, when the shaft was being sunk, was wound with a water wheel in that gill. No longer there, of course. And it was fed with a low water course that comes along there like that, down there. From a gill further up, there's a little humpback bridge when you go up that road, and when you're on a motorbike, if you don't hang on, you'll end up all back if you're on the pillion. My wife did once, not when I was riding the bike, but somebody when his first husband riding the bike. And there's another little bridge over a gill that comes in from the left. Now, that gill is locally known as Turnwheel Gill, and that's where the water came from to run that wheel. So there was an instance of water wheels being used for winding before the hydraulic engine was installed. That's the foundation for the winder there, or part of the foundation for the winder. That's a little jockey pulley that the winding rope went over. The pulley's missing, possibly made of wood, could have been, but the pedestal and the shaft are still there. And that's what, you remember on the drawing I showed you, that's the bob hole. Now what's the bob hole? Well, the bob hole, there'd be a balance weight on that linkage. Why? Because one length of spear rods went right down to the bottom to run the first lift, and the other set only came from halfway up, and the bob, the balance bob, or the balance weight, we call it the Cornish term balance bob, would be used to make up the difference in weight between the two sets of spears, so that the spears became effectively weightless, and you're just lifting the water. Now then, this is a one that, although it's later, we don't really know that much about. So we know where it was, I'll show you where it was, but we know it was supplied by Witham, who died in, I think, 1868. I'll just get another piece of paper if I can find it. I'm getting there now. And he died, Witham died in 1868, and so it hadn't been in very long. The thing is, the strange mystery is that William Witham in 1861 census was down as engineer woolen mill, but not hydraulic engineer at all, which is a bit strange. That's the entrance to Price Level. It's in Washfold near Hurst, and the river flows down through Helwith, that some of you will have been down to, and eventually joins the Swale. It's called Shaw Beck, and it was only started somewhere about 1850, something like that. I never made a note of that. The water to the engine, I'll show you a plan later. I'm going to do it in a slightly different order. The water to the engine came from Hurst Dam, which wasn't particularly big, by a Rowan Hush, down across Benty Gutter, across if you turn left at the T-junction in Hurst, you'll see there's a water course goes across the road, and that's it. And it went behind the tips at Queen's Level, across the road that goes to the T-junction, and then across the to the road nearly at the Prize. It's just going down to Prize Farm. Just to the right-hand side of the road is a reservoir. I'm standing on the road, and then from the reservoir, the pipes went down to this little tree there. And there's that little tree with no leaves on it. There's the water course, and there's the top of the shaft. The pipe shaft was sunk about 130 feet, roughly, specially for the hydraulic engine, which was actually working a sump on the Walnock North Vein. Of course, everything was trammed out of Prize Level, where we just started at, and the water ran out there as well. That's what the system looks like underground. That's the Walnut vein. Prize level adit. The adit mouth somewhere out here somewhere. And prize level adit runs in here like this. Then it joins the Walnut North vein. Holds into the Walnut North vein there. Runs along the Walnut North vein. There's two entries into the engine shaft. One's where the ground was trammed out. It was a cage winder, so it was trammed out. It would be trammed out in tubs. There may even have been a changeover point somewhere into horse wagons. Almost certainly was. That must have had steps in it because the floor of the engine chamber is 12 foot above the floor or sole of the horse level. And that's quite a rise, so there would have been some steps somewhere in this area because that's the pressure pipe, the track of the pressure pipe coming to the shaft, and the pressure pipe wouldn't go uphill, so the bit between there and the chamber must have been level. So this tiny little first bit we think must have steps in. Anyway, we've reached a point here about now, and the fall, and we know there's another fall about there because Northern Mines got to it in about 1986, but we'll get through it if we want. No, it's not a problem, it's just very wet. And all the coloured levels that's the water level. It was a natural drain, and they relied on that before they sank the engine sump. It was a natural drain, and it used to get flooded in winter so it couldn't work. And it used to stop the ventilation as well because it used to take air. And there's the levels going down to 45 fathom level. And there's the engine shaft, and of course there'll be crosscuts through to each level. It's sunk more or less, and on section, the shaft goes between the water level and the engine chamber, and then the vein dips away to the right, heads back up to the engine house. Right. People who read books about gunnerside gill and mining will probably most of them tell you that Sir George Dennis and the AD Company did great things because they were the first to put a hydraulic engine in a mine in Gunnerside Gill, and it cost £4,500 and blah, 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 blah. Well, it's absolute. The first company, and Sir George Dennis would write it BOLLOCKS. The first company to put an engine into Francis level was almost a rival, if you like, of the AD Company. It was the Old Gang Company. Right. It was on nowhere near the same scale as the AD Company. I don't know what it cost, but it can't have been very much. How do we know? Well, has anybody in this room, how many in this room been to the engine house in Sir Francis? Oh, good, loads. Right, okay. Well, when you're going on the crosscut, go through the fallen shale bit down into the water again, at which point, for some unknown reason, the level rises quite quickly. They'd save themselves some money if you kept it flattened. You're soon fairly well out of the water again, and then you come to a right turn, and you come to a left turn on the old rake, not Sir George Dennis told you, the Friarfold. It's not the Friarfold then, it's the old rake. And you get to the engine house up the steps. And I'm going to talk about that in a bit. But before that, and before you turn left on the vein, there's a little inset. And at one time, there was an iron spear rod knuckle stuck up there. That is the Old Gang engine sump. And the Old Gang engine house, which at one time would have been much higher than it is now, so they could get the spear rods in and out of the sump if they wanted to service the pumps, is actually on the far side of that. The back end of that little inset, there's a shale fall on. And if you've noticed it, the engine house is behind that. And if you go along the horse level in the vein, 5 or 6 yards, there's a big wall, big cheek wall up on the left-hand side. If you climb up that, you can see into the old gang engine house. Still there, but it's half full of shale. And that's where they put this engine in 1879. And let's see what signs of it, apart from what I've just told you about, and a couple of slides later, we can see of it. This is Bunting Tips. Bunting Level Mouth is just behind me and on my right, but the mine shop and smithy is on my left and a little bit behind me as well. If you notice, there's a fairly obvious ditch going in the foreground, running through the tips. It's been dug out. And then further on, there's a fairly obvious notch in the tips. That's where there was a wooden launder coming from Bunting Level Mouth, taking water from there and possibly also from Water Sykes Gill. Bit unreliable, but there is a fairly decent spring at Water Sykes Gill, and there's a launder runs along the back of the tips going onto the dressing floors that right past Bunting Level Mouth. So we're assuming that that's where it went from. And it went from there, down the tips and underground. There's a bit of the wooden launder, I'm pretty sure of that. 9-inch square. Why is it there? What's it doing? It wasn't doing anything basically. Be sunk below Sir George level at that point at a later date. And I think they brought in bits of the launder to timber it up. There's certainly some been broken up to make a big shoveling plate that I'm standing on to take that photograph, so they could actually fill the horse wagons. And that's more or less how I reckon the layout was. Unfortunately, it wasn't particularly efficient. We rely on some of this information. Unfortunately, it didn't work for the old gang company. Sir George Dennis's agent, until Sir George Dennis died in 1881, was a fellow called Thomas Rowe. And he left a letter book, which, what did he call that woman who wrote the Swaledale, The Spirit Speaks Loud or something? Oh, for God's sake. Well, anyway, she got hold of it. And I don't know whether she still has it, but fortunately I managed to get hold of it through John Watton, who was in the punch bowl, I worked at the punch bowl at the time, and Margaret, my wife, typed it out, so I do at least have a copy of it. And he talks about this old gang engine going in, and he called it a fancy pump, and he was a bit snidey about the whole thing. But he said that the pump was struggling at 84 feet deep. They were actually having to bail water up into a cistern, which is incredible, because, I mean, basically it's got a static head of 232 feet, and it's only got a 4-inch pipe, but well, as you will see in a minute, they've got twin column pumps. They both went to the bottom, 5.5-inch working barrel, 6-inch column, and I reckon that to run those pumps at what would probably be somewhere about 30 working strokes a minute, that's all. You would need only 16,000 gallons an hour of feed water. But for some reason, it didn't seem to work very well. And I'll come back to that shortly. That's the feed pipe underground. Many of you will have seen that. It's a 4-inch pipe. Pete, are you watching? There's my bar. Okay, so if it goes down again, I left it there. Anyway, that 4-inch valve has probably had a safety valve on it. It's the lowest point. It's not there now. There's a gutter, all there is a gutter purchase seal, but whoever took, and it might have been brass, it probably was brass, and whoever took it off for scrap kindly actually put the bolts back and the nuts on them. but or they may have even broken it off, I don't know. But that comes down the shaft from Sir George level, across the level and into the engine chamber, which is there. There's one of the top knuckles. Some bright sparks broken that off now, haven't they? But it's still there. That's one of the top knuckles on one of the spears rods. And we cleared this off once when we were there. There's the top casting called the bull's nose. There's the top casting of the pump. And those are the two pump columns. There and there. And you can see 6 inch. But the working barrels will be 5.5 inches because there'll be several buckets as you went down, 3 or 4 probably in that depth. And the pistons on the buckets work in these working barrels, and there must be less diameter than the others so you can pull them out. They keep clean and shiny because the buckets are working in there with seals on. But the rest would get mucked up, so you need to allow a little bit of diameter to draw the spears out. And there they are, and that's what it worked. Not very big pumps. And of course the slow speed as well doesn't help. Oh. Right. How many of you can remember June 24th, 1961? I certainly can. I was walking up Gunnerside Gill, well actually walking down Gunnerside Gill, with 3 members of EB Mines Research Group. We'd had a poke about in Bunting, I think, and Priscilla, and I didn't know the area very well at all, because still living near Skipton. And we met a chap who was walking up the Gill. "Oh, I see you've been underground, lads." "Yes, aye. Yeah. I think I know who this chap was, but I won't mention his name because I'm not absolutely certain." "Yep, right, I've been underground, yeah." He says, "Have you been down to Francis Mine?" "No, it's blocked." "Ah, but there's an air shaft behind it you can get in. I'll show you where it is." So he took us and showed us the air shaft that we go down now. Although it was opened up later, that's another story, I can't tell that today, it'd take too long. And we went down. Overalls, woolies, pair of old trousers, that's all. Carbide, acetylene lamps. Nothing wrong with the acetylene lamps if you look after them. Anyway, we went in and we free climbed that shaft. Went down, deep water, up to here. And, well, it's getting on for a mile. Not all in deep water, but a hell of a lot of it was then, because the water gets away a bit better now, doesn't it, in the first bit than it used to do. Well, bloody frozen. We ended up, and this chap had said, "There's an engine in there, you know." He said, "We went in." He said, "And he'd been in with the Shevels brothers looking for varieties." "That's right." And he said, we had to kick a door down at the top of the steps to get in the engine house. Well, anyway, so we go on, and it was that kept us going, and we got there, up the steps, and sure enough, there's the door laying on the floor. And this is what we found. Forgive the 18-year-old scribble. Nobody's ever seen that before. Notice particularly the anvil on that bench there was full of tools. Gland packings, spares, nuts and bolts. A kettle on a trivet with a spirit burner to make a cup of tea. It all went very, very quickly. I do know a chap, but he's died, who shortly after took some photographs. Not Frank, who took the first photograph of the talk there. That was later. He took that with flash powder. It's the only one he took because the engine chamber filled with smoke, and he couldn't take any more. But yes, that was what it was like. 25th of June, sorry, did I say June? 25th of July. And to be quite honest, for a first visit with somebody who basically hadn't done a lot about mine, didn't know a lot about mine, had never been there before. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but if those people have been down, I don't think it's too bad, is it? Actually, you know, it's pretty good. However, everything went, apart from, of course, the engine, the pumps and the pipes, the cage, which is now at threat because one of the beams is broken. But anyway, we'll carry on. The water, we always chase the water, comes from Lownethwaite Dam, and that is situated as you walk up the track to the smelt mill, Blake's Mill, situated on the left of the track, somewhere about opposite, just below Bunting, somewhere like that. And there is the water, there's a track for the pipe, been taken out under the road. It's like piece knickers have fallen down. It's a good job you've got another pair on it. Oh yeah. The 10-inch main, they got the idea this time, always have a big feed pipe. There's the pumps as they were in 2014. It was a double ram. Both these columns would go to the bottom. And we do know what the horsepower was supposed to be, and it does work out when you calculate it pretty well. You would actually... wait a minute, I'm reading the wrong thing. Yeah, the head on these pumps, on the whole thing, was 440 foot. So the pressure in the engine house, that means it was 231 pound per square inch, which is quite appreciable. Balanced twin ram pumps, designed to lift 30,000 gallon an hour from 360 feet. They never reach 360 feet, they only reach 127 foot to the bottom of the sump. There's 13-inch bore and 7-foot stroke, and they're balanced over a wheel at the top. Up, down, up, down. So each movement is a working stroke. The winding drum of the engine, winding engine, 6-foot diameter, geared down 6-to-1 from a twin-cylinder engine with cylinders 5.5 inches bore and 16-inch stroke. I told you, tiny cylinders, really. Running at 19.5 RPM to give a hoisting speed of 61.3 feet a minute. Very slow, very, very slow. But for that time, well, maybe not so bad. And I would have said that although it was rated at 50 horsepower, they'd have been in trouble if there'd been plenty of water, because the pumps themselves, taking a full load of water at full revolutions, would have taken 57.6 horsepower at 360 feet. So they wouldn't have been able to run the winder at all if there'd been a lot of water. Anyway, they only sank 127. And the feed water, you see, because of the increased pressure and increased head, the feed water was only 34,500 gallons per minute to run both machines. They could run them both at once, of course, if necessary. That's the that's the shave. Unfortunately, within the last 10 years anyway, one of the bears has broken, look, on the sheaf platform. We've got to do something about that. First thing we did was put some chains and chain up the cage on that side where the rope's tied to get the weight off the headgear. And you could see how it sunk because, oh wait a minute. To get the weight off the headgear because that chain's slack. That balance wheel there, balances the 2 pump columns, has dropped. Starting there, it's dropped right through from there, and it's sacking the rope, the chain, unfortunately. There's a cage in the shaft, hung up. The interesting thing is those are the caps there that would be lowered when the cage came up. You raise the cage, lower the caps and drop the cage onto the caps. The last time they brought that cage up, they never even bothered to do that. They just left it hanging on the rope. And of course that cage would take horse wagon. No. That's a sort of a combination of everything going on down the old Sir Francis mine. Let me have a look at that. The AD Company engine ran till 1891, January was it, 1891. It was commissioned in end of 1881, so now ran till January 1891. And what the dates were on actually. But for 7 years during that period, it never ran at all. They didn't have the money. They were low in funds. The price of lead was terrible. That's another factor. It was at £28 a ton in 1874. By 1890, it had dropped to £9.50p a ton on the London Metal Exchange, and that's a hell of a drop. So, apart from the fact that I don't think things were quite so good down there in the 3rd and 4th and 5th limes below the underset lime as they hoped they would be. Now this is, to me, is the most interesting bit of the lot. It's the last bit as well. How are we doing? Sir Francis level was started in 1864, but by July 1869, it had only been driven 420 yards, which isn't a very good rate. It's 84 yards a year. It took about 15 years to get where they were going. So Sir George Dennis, who was, well, he was primary shareholder of the AD Company. I hesitate to call him managing director. It was a joint stock company, and it's very difficult to actually say what he would like his job title to be. But he was also owner of the mineral rights. And he decided that he would form a little company and he would contract to drive the level forward using compressed air machinery. Now, remember, this is actually in, it actually was 1869. And by September 1869, everything was in place. They bought second hand a 38-foot water wheel, a bit wider than that. It had a 4-foot breast, and it was, I estimate it to be 40 horsepower wheel. Cost £100. And they bought a Lowe's improved 2-cylinder compressor. They're out of business now. That cost £150, and it fed a McClellan egg-ended air receiver, tested at £60 per square inch only. All the stuff was supplied by a firm called Turner's of Ipswich, funnily enough. And after this, he looked around, while this was being built, he looked around to see what sort of rock drills he would like to buy. And at 1869, there wasn't a lot of choice, believe me. In Cornwall, there were, which was always said to be the cradle of machine drilling. It really wasn't actually. The Gotthard Tunnel was the cradle of machine drilling. But he managed to light on the McKean rock drill. Where, I don't know. In theory, he's said to have gone down to Cornwall to look at the drills there. But I can tell you for an absolute fact, there were no McKean rock drills at work in Cornwall in 1869. The first McKean rock drills were introduced into Kincroft mine in the late 1870s. So he didn't see them there. He could have seen them in Scotland because they were being demonstrated in a quarry in 1872, as I'll show you in a minute. However, how we got to know them, I don't know. But each of these drills cost £100. Add 2 notes, £10,000 for a bloody rock drill. That is expensive. You can buy a good jackhammer today for 850 quid. So basically it was a big leap forward, a really big leap forward. Nobody else had done it. He was the first man in the Yorkshire Dales, anyway, certainly, to introduce compressed air into a mine. It was fed to the drills through 2-inch steel pipe, which you can see on the right-hand side. That's where the level splits. If you look on the left, you can just see the cage hanging in the shaft that I showed you in the previous photograph. The drills also ran using a water feed, but not into the drill itself. Hollow steels were invented in the late 1880s only, and the first drill to use them for the people who like this sort of thing was called a water laner, and that used hollow drill steels that fed the water up into the hole. They would have actually used just a squirter, but there was a little 1/2-inch pipe which is still there in places on the way up, and it was only 1/2-inch, and it was taken off the compressor, which had a weird and soon obsolete form of cooling known as water injection. Water was actually injected using compressed air into the feed air, into the compressor. Oiling must have been a real problem. You wouldn't have been able to use mineral oil, there wasn't that much about anyway, and you would have to use a vegetable oil that emulsified with water, otherwise you wouldn't get proper lubrication. And from the drain, from the cylinders that got rid of this water injection, was actually fed under pressure into this 1/2-inch pipe, which was actually fed up the level underneath the 2-inch, but it's mostly just rusted away and literally to nothing by now. I have a photograph of a McKean drill, hand wound just like that. You can see he's winding the handle with his left hand. This is not a McKean drill. I think it's a Tucking Mill Foundry drill, which was taken over by Holman's one time. You can see matey squirting the water, but his water is actually got from a pressurised can, if you like, barrel there. Compressed air's fed into it from the airline, and water's fed out via the hose there into the squirter, if you like. I'm just wondering how much of that they use, because they'll have to keep filling the tank up. In fact, if you look very carefully on the left, I've never noticed, on the right, there's a little funnel there for filling it up in situ. So how much that would be. Anyway, that's the type of machine that they use, and it's mounted on what's called a single jack column with a universal fitting, so that you can actually tilt the drill up and down or wind it from side to side. Clamp it up again, of course, before you start to use it. Anyway, by March 1877, the old rake, I'm as bad as blooming Sir George, the old rake vein was cut, and it was taking a little over 7 years to drive, and that's 157 yards a year instead of 84. It's nearly twice as fast. And I've done some analysis of the drills. I won't go into it actually, but they actually ran at about 750 strokes a minute, taking 50 psi, taking only 40 cubic CFM, because it's a positive drive. It's a cylinder and a piston, bum 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 bum. Percussion drill, or technically it's a tappet valve piston drill, not the old jackhammer now that you set off and it roars away. That's a hammer, called a hammer drill. They were far slower running, and I reckoned, I'll just read this out. I've calculated the drilling rate per machine at 4.07 feet per hour, allowing for all the stoppages, and that compares with contemporary drills and many of a later date. There was a great big trial done in 1899 in Joburg in South Africa on the Witwatersrand, and they brought drills from all over the world: America, UK, South Africa itself, ran Slugger, various other drills, and actually they tested them, and I know it was in harder strata, but allowing for at least 1/3 of the time for changing your drills. You start with a short one, and there's a McKean drill set up for shaft sinking on a heavy stand. Just a piston, and you notice the steel, there. There you are, there's one. Gunnerside Museum, just Steve Calvert's museum. And the shape of the bit, although these are much later, these are called the cruciform bit, those are knock-on bits, the 1950s, 1940s, something like that. The same cruciform bit, drilled a much bigger hole, you could get more powder in it, and you could do more work. But anyway, back to that. What I'm saying is they did I think they did pretty well, the drills, but according to Sir George Dennis, the maintenance costs were horrendous. I didn't know what they were, but I didn't make a note of them here. Anyway, working conditions, very noisy, very wet at times. The great beauty of the drills also, not the increased rate, but the fact that they didn't need to sink any more air shafts, because they used the exhaust air to keep the men alive, to breathe, and also they could leave the compressor on when they blasted to clear the smoke out. I mean, we used to do that. So basically it saved a lot of money, although at £10.50p a fathom driven, it wasn't a cheap exercise. So George reckoned he made money out of it anyway. So anyway, they reached the old rate, and there was a lot of celebration, big barrel of beer and a sort of a hog roast and one or two other things. And very quickly, this wasn't the end of the use of the compressor. They carried on driving. Oh, I'll just show you basic, I forgot about that slide. They couldn't drill around and delay the holes because delay detonators hadn't been invented. There were electric detonators, and these were used, and this is what they used, with a high tension exploder, 500 volt high tension exploder. But they would not have to fire all the holes at once, or just one hole at a time. And in broken ground or jointed ground, which limestone's very much like that, and some gritstones are as well, this is the sort of thing you could probably get away with. You might get some uneven breaks and a few hang-ups, but if you look at that and the way it is, and they would know, they would study the ground. They would study the cracks and would get you to know which of the cracks, which of the backs were good, which of them would slip, which of them wouldn't. And I reckon in limestone I could probably get 4 holes off at the same time in a setup like that. And the blue line would be roughly what my advance would be. So anyway, a success. And they carried on driving Sir Francis level for quite some time. They overhauled the compressor and drive it up into Water Sykes vein but they would only be able to use one drill, because just after halfway, where the level narrows down, just before you get to that high ground, the level narrows down. Well, that's probably where they run out of enough air to run 2 drills, because the compressor was only, I reckon, could only have been rated 100 cubic foot a minute and 55 psi. And they wouldn't run it higher than receiver pressure, which was tested at 60. And literally 2-inch pipes were not big enough. They would run out of enough of air pressure to run 2 drills efficiently. And I reckon where it narrows down is where they went down to 1 drill. However, this last slide here, when they were sinking their sump, the AD company, to put the hydraulic engine on with the cage in that you've just seen, they used one of these. Well, it probably looked something like that. And they sank to 127 feet with it. Not only that, they were actually working their part. They were working tip ladies drift 60 foot below. They were getting out to a drawing ore. They only let the sump flood when they started installing the engine, and then they drained it again. So, because it couldn't work, there was people when you're out building the engine out, arching it, and so on. But this actually was really the last fling of the compressed air system, and it was not very efficient, I'm afraid. It was, I reckoned here, I think they would probably have done about 3,000. No, Thomas Rowe said, he didn't work it out quite like I've worked it out, but it was raising 3,300 gallons an hour from 65 feet. This is little there. Looks like it's probably even got 1.5 inch stub on it there to feed it. There's the air cylinder. There's what drove it. Oh, there's what drove it. Compressed air in and out, suction, and a foot. On that suction would be a filter, strum. And I mean, that would only require 1.2 horsepower. What with a 40 horsepower wheel and something like a 12.5, 13 horsepower compressor. And it could only, there must have been something dreadfully wrong. Anyway, they managed it. Air leaks probably, and they were having an awful lot of trouble getting enough water to run that water wheel, because the water courses were in a very sad state by the late 1870s, 1880s, early 1880s. And also they put some new dressing floors in at Sir Francis, hadn't they? And that they were taking more water because they were more mechanised. And they put round buddles in, circular buddles, and they take a lot of water. So they were having trouble certain time actually running the water wheel at all. So there we are. I've gone a little bit longer maybe than I should have done. And I would like to thank you all for coming and listening to me. And I'm sorry I've gone on a little bit too long, and I hope you've enjoyed it. Thank you very much.